Where the River Runs Red by Howard K. Pollack. Prologue. He didn't do it. Plain and simple. It wasn't him. But there he was anyway, 17 years old, sitting in a jam-packed courtroom, waiting for the jury to come back and render its verdict. The trial didn't go well. Everything moved in slow motion. Chad Greer's attorney, sitting to his left, had a dour look on his face. He wouldn't even look at Chad. He just kept sifting through his papers, apparently searching for something buried there that he hoped would magically change the outcome. Chad was cold. Further over, Cole Hanratty, the D.A. prosecuting him, had a victorious half-grin plastered on a pock-marked face. Out of the corner of his eye, Chad saw Sheriff Chuck Marshall staring him down. Chad blamed him as the one who railroaded him and set him up to take the fall. Someday, Chad promised to himself, he was going to make him pay. Behind Chad, his baby sister had her head on his mom's shoulder. She dabbed tears from her eyes with a tissue. Dad wasn't there, and Chad knew he couldn't give a shit. There wasn't an empty seat in the courtroom. Hushed whispers and accusing eyes burned at his back, giving him the creeps. The door at the head of the courtroom opened, and a court officer appeared. "All rise," he said in a deep, gravelly voice. A corpulent man sporting a black robe followed behind and moved to the bench. "Presenting the Honorable Leonard B. Markovich." Everyone stood, and the room went completely silent. "Be seated," the judge said as he sat down. He eyed the court reporter. "On the record." "Yes, Your Honor." Peering over his glasses, he panned to the D.A., looked at Chad's lawyer, then at Chad, but he avoided Chad's glare and said, "The jury has reached its verdict." He focused his gaze at the court officer and gestured towards the other door. "Officer Rios, please bring them in." Rios walked to the door on the other side of the judge's bench, opened it, and ushered in 7 men and 5 women who marched in lockstep. Chad looked at them one by one, but they too avoided his eyes. As they sat, hushed voices rose again from the gallery. "There will be no talking," the judge bellowed. The room went silent once more as the jurors took their seats. He looked over to them. "I understand you've reached your verdict?" "We have, Your Honor," said the man sitting in the front row, leftmost seat. Chad shivered. The court officer walked over, and the juror handed him a folded sheet of paper. The judge motioned to the court officer, who passed him the paper. He unfolded it, raised his chin, and quickly refolded it, stared directly at Chad, this time looking directly into Chad's eyes. "Will the defendant please rise?" His lawyer turned to Chad, who was wobbly on his feet and couldn't fully stand. He took him by the arm and pulled him up. The judge turned back to the foreman. "Verdict, please." The man rose and, without any emotion, said, "We, the jury, find the defendant, Chadwick Stephen Greer, guilty of murder in the first degree." Chad's knees weakened, and as he collapsed, he screamed out, "I didn't do it!" Chapter 1. 15 years later. Sawyer Greer, late 20s, slender, with sharp features, was conservatively dressed in a pantsuit that shouted, "Lawyer." She was early, so she waited in the hallway outside hearing room 333, still unsure of what to expect. It had been 15 years since her brother Chad was incarcerated, and today was his initial parole hearing. She had visited him regularly, even during her stint at law school. Now, only months into her job working for the Marion County D.A.'s office, she was hoping to be able to help with Chad's parole. She believed all along that he was innocent and had been wrongfully convicted, and so she intended to dedicate her life and her career to uncovering the truth. What better way to do that than to land a job at the D.A.'s office? At 10 a.m., the door to the hearing room opened and she walked inside. After taking her seat in the gallery, a few other people entered the room and sat down. She didn't recognize any of them other than Anthony and Audrey Miller, the murdered girl Megan's parents. She expected them, and if they were given a chance to speak, she figured they would demand that the parole board keep Chad incarcerated for the rest of his life. Chad was ushered in dressed in a suit and tie purchased by Sawyer. He looked handsome, but much thinner, and more weathered than when she saw him 2 months ago. He forced a smile and nodded at her. The hearing began, and the parole board, consisting of 3 people, 2 men and 1 woman, each peppered Chad with standard questions. Finally, hearing officer Marcia DeMonte, a large black woman with heavily braided brown hair, asked Chad if he had anything more to say. Chad turned and looked at Sawyer. She nodded, offering a faint smile of support. "Thank you all for granting me this parole opportunity," said Chad. "I simply want to say I've suffered a lot. Being here, I've been beaten, stabbed, and assaulted in a way I don't like talking about. I hope you take into consideration that I never caused anybody any problems. For 15 years I've been reading, learning, and educating myself so that the day I walk free I rejoin the community, hold down a proper job, be with my sister and friends from school. 15 years have been stolen from me for a crime I didn't commit. That's all I have to say." He wiped tears from his eyes and lowered his head. After a few minutes of silence, while the 3 hearing officers spoke quietly to one another, Mrs. DeMonte addressed the room. "Mr. Greer, you were convicted of first-degree murder by a jury of your peers. It was only because you were convicted as a youthful offender that you were able to get a parole hearing after only 15 years in jail. So the fact that you served 15 years and suffered in prison is not a concern of ours. Based on the evidence, it's what you deserve and where you belong. We all thought you would have come to your senses by now, fessed up for what you did. That's what troubles us. Still, after 15 years in prison, you continue to claim some sort of bizarre innocence. You refuse to admit the horrific crime you committed. Because of this, we have no choice but to deny your request for parole." Chad stood and shouted, "I didn't do anything to Megan!" "She had your DNA all over her," retorted Mrs. DeMonte. "I was her friend," said Chad. "You raped her, bashed her in the skull, threw her in the river. That's the kind of friend you are, because she didn't give in to you?" asked Miss DeMonte. "I didn't do any of that. I didn't hurt her," said Chad. "You are a liar, Mr. Greer," Ms. DeMonte stated dismissively. Chad grew angry. "So you want me to confess to a lie?" "A word of advice, Mr. Greer. If 12 people saw you eating oats, it's time to admit you're a horse." "That doesn't even make any sense," said Chad. Ms. DeMonte put her hand on her hip. "I don't believe this," she said. "A murderer is here to lecture me on what makes sense? Maybe if you'd listened to what your father taught you, you'd have made better life choices." "For your information," Chad said, growing angrier, "my father was a low-life drunk. I wouldn't listen to him to get a pardon from the governor." "You don't really mean that, do you, son?" asked Hearing Officer James Abernathy, a pale, balding older man. Chad thought about it for a moment, then said conclusively, "You never met him." Mr. Abernathy shook his head. "Son, you haven't learned a damn thing in these 15 years, have you? You have a golden opportunity here to confess to the murder you clearly committed, and instead you waste our time talking about being a good friend to the girl you murdered in cold blood. I don't know why we even bothered giving you a hearing in the first place. Clearly, you are incorrigible. You deserve to rot in prison for the rest of your life." Chad's temper boiled. "This whole hearing is bullshit," he exclaimed. Extending his middle finger at them, he spit at the board. "You can all go fuck yourselves with a 10-foot cow prod." Quickly, the officer standing nearby grabbed Chad by the arm, cuffed him, and dragged him out of the room. Sawyer was mortified. She stood and approached the hearing officers. "Excuse me, but I have something to say on this matter, and I would like to address the board." Hearing Officer Abernathy stood and asked, "And who might you be, ma'am?" "My name is Sawyer Greer. I'm an attorney with the D.A.'s office. I am also Chad Greer's sister." "D.A. or not, you have no standing in this proceeding, Miss Greer, so save your breath," said Abernathy. "I'm afraid this is neither the time nor the place, and, as an attorney, you should know that anything you want to say regarding this matter must be brought up in court, not at a parole board hearing. Please see yourself out." With that, he and the other board members turned and exited. Defeated, Sawyer fell back in her seat and wept. After taking a few minutes to gather herself, she rose and left the room. Walking through the parking lot, she was approached by a man she didn't know, but whom she recognized from the hearing. He had been seated in the last row. "Hello, Miss Greer," he said. "My name is Mason Walcott. I saw you at the hearing and would like to talk to you." "About?" "Your brother and his case, of course." "Well, who are you?" "I'm a journalist. I wrote articles about Chad 15 years ago." Sawyer squinted, eyeing him up and down. "So why would I want to talk to you?" "I know some things about Chad, and I also came to a different conclusion than the jury. I also don't believe your brother was guilty, but I didn't have any hard evidence of that." "Really?" She furrowed her brow, still looking at Walcott suspiciously. "In my experience, journalists rarely concern themselves with the guilt or innocence of a suspect. More than likely, you're simply looking for a juicy story to pin a Pulitzer on." "I wish I was working for that kind of fancy paper," said Walcott, almost to himself. "So why take an interest in an old case that only the immediate families of those involved care about?" asked Sawyer. "It doesn't make any sense." "It's a long story. Perhaps you'd be willing to grab a cup of coffee with me so we can talk about it." Looking him up and down and noting his warm smile and demeanor, she was intrigued and reasoned that she had nothing to lose by listening to the man. After all, she was only hitting dead ends today. So she nodded in agreement. "There's a Starbucks just down the road a piece," he said. "I can meet you there in 10 minutes.